When you first hear that Canada is opening a consulate in Greenland, it sounds almost administrative, the kind of thing that barely registers as news. A small diplomatic office in a distant Arctic capital does not feel like something that should make a former US president nervous or trigger talk of shifting power balances. But that surface reaction is exactly why this story matters. What looks modest is actually structural. What looks symbolic is material. And what looks like routine diplomacy is, in fact, a quiet challenge to how power in the Arctic has been assumed to work for decades. Most people saw the headlines about Donald Trump once again talking about Greenland as if it were a piece of real estate, something that could be acquired if the price was right or the pressure strong enough. That framing makes it sound like an eccentric obsession, a personality quirk, something to laugh off or dismiss as bluster. But behind that rhetoric sits a very real strategic anxiety in Washington about losing influence in a region that is no longer frozen in time. The Arctic is warming, shipping routes are opening, minerals are becoming accessible, and military planners are paying close attention. This is not a distant frontier anymore, it is a crossroads. What officially happened is straightforward. Canada announced it would open its first ever consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. A senior Canadian minister traveled north to mark the occasion. The language was calm and diplomatic about expanding Canada's Arctic presence and deepening cooperation with other Arctic partners. No threats, no grandstanding, no talk of ownership or control, just presence, just showing up. But the reaction inside Greenland is where the deeper story begins. Greenlandic leaders did not treat this as a minor gesture. One parliamentarian summed it up with a single word that carried years of frustration and anticipation. Finally, that response tells you something important. For generations, Inuit communities across Canada, Alaska, and Greenland have been culturally connected while politically separated by borders drawn far away. Economically, Greenland has remained tied almost entirely to Denmark, even as its geography and interests increasingly point west toward North America. The new consulate signals recognition of that reality. This is not just about flags and offices. Greenland imports goods from Canada but routes much of its trade through Europe, adding cost, delay, and dependency. A Canadian diplomatic presence opens the door to alternative supply chains, closer economic integration, and relationships built on proximity rather than colonial inheritance. When Greenlandic officials talk about wanting deeper ties with the North American economic system, they are talking about agency, about options, about not being trapped between a distant metropole and an overbearing superpower. And that is where Washington's discomfort comes in. The United States already has a military footprint in Greenland. It already has a consulate there. But trust matters as much as hardware. And that trust was badly damaged when the idea of buying Greenland was floated as if its people were an afterthought. Denmark called the proposal absurd. Greenlanders called it disrespectful. The message received was not partnership but entitlement. Canada's move lands in that vacuum. It offers something fundamentally different. Not acquisition but cooperation. Not dominance but respect for local autonomy. At the same time, Denmark itself has become more wary of American behavior in Greenland, even raising concerns about covert political influence. That friction within NATO is not trivial. It creates space for other actors to step forward as stabilizing partners. What we are watching here is not a sudden rupture, but a gradual realignment. Canada is investing heavily in clean energy, Arctic infrastructure, and long-term industrial capacity. It is deepening ties with Denmark around green technology and energy systems that will matter more, not less, in a world facing carbon constraints. These are not flashy moves. They do not fit neatly into cable news drama, but they build power the slow way by making yourself useful, reliable, and present. The Arctic will not belong to the loudest voice or the biggest threat. It will belong to those who understand that influence today comes from building systems people actually want to be part of. Canada understood that. Greenland noticed. And Washington, for perhaps the first time in a long while, is realizing that influence can slip away quietly without a single confrontation when someone else simply does the work you chose not to do. To understand why this quiet move matters so much, You have to look past personalities and into the structure of how power actually works in regions like the Arctic. The United States has long assumed that strategic dominance comes from military presence and financial leverage, bases, patrols, pressure, and deals negotiated far from the communities affected. That model worked in a colder world, both literally and politically, but the Arctic is warming and so is the politics around it. Communities that were once treated as peripheral are now central, and they are paying close attention to who listens and who dictates. When Canada opens a consulate instead of making demands, it is signaling something very specific. It is saying that influence begins with relationship, not control. That may sound soft, but in economic terms, it is anything but. Relationships determine trade flows, they determine infrastructure decisions, and they determine which standards get adopted and which supply chains become resilient over time. They determine where capital feels safe to settle. This is the part of the story most coverage misses entirely. Greenland's interest in closer integration with North America is not ideological. It is practical. Shipping everything through Denmark is expensive. Depending on distant decision makers slows development. Watching major trade agreements from the outside while your neighbors integrate more deeply creates a sense of permanent exclusion. When Greenlandic leaders talk about collaboration with Canada, they are talking about reducing costs, shortening supply lines, and gaining leverage in their own future negotiations. That is economics, not symbolism. Now contrast that with the American approach under Trump. The fixation on tariffs, threats, and zero-sum bargaining was designed to project strength. But strength that relies on coercion tends to erode trust. And once trust is gone, presence becomes hollow. You can have a base on the map and still lose influence in the room. That is what we are seeing play out. Canada did not push the United States out of the Arctic. The United States weakened its own position by misunderstanding what power looks like in a changing system. There is also a deeper economic shift happening here that rarely gets mentioned. Canada has been pouring public investment into energy infrastructure, particularly clean and nuclear power, at levels not seen in decades. These investments are not just about climate targets. They are about industrial security. They lower long-term energy costs, stabilize manufacturing, and make Canadian exports more competitive in a world that is beginning to price carbon seriously. When Europe moves toward carbon border adjustments, countries with clean production gain an edge. Canada knows this, Denmark knows this, Greenland, watching from the middle, knows this too. So when Ottawa strengthens ties with Denmark and Greenland around clean technology and Arctic cooperation, it is aligning economic incentives with diplomatic ones. This is how durable influence is built, not through sudden deals, but through systems that make cooperation the rational choice. The United States, meanwhile, has been consumed by short-term confrontation, assuming that pressure alone can substitute for investment. That assumption is proving costly. For ordinary people, this can feel abstract. So let me translate it. When a country invests in stable energy and infrastructure, jobs last longer, prices fluctuate less, communities plan instead of react. When influence is built through cooperation rather than coercion, supply chains are less likely to snap overnight. Food, fuel, and materials move more predictably. That stability is invisible when it works and devastating when it disappears. The media loves drama, so it frames this story as Trump versus Canada or as a personality clash over Greenland. That framing misses the real question. The question is why one country is quietly expanding its capacity while another keeps reaching for leverage it no longer fully controls. The question is why showing up, listening, and investing now carries more weight than shouting later. This is not an accident. It is how the current economic system rewards certain behaviors and punishes others. Long-term planning rarely grabs headlines, but it reshapes the map all the same. If you want to understand where power is going in the Arctic, stop listening to who talks the loudest. Watch who builds the most quietly and who others choose to work with when given a real choice. There is a lesson here that goes well beyond Greenland, and it is one we see repeated across the global economy. Power that relies on intimidation is fast but fragile. Power that relies on capacity is slow but durable. For years, the United States has leaned harder and harder on the former, assuming that access to its market, its military reach, and its currency would always be enough to bend outcomes in its favor. That assumption is now colliding with reality in places that were once taken for granted. Look at how Greenland responded, not with fear, not with defiance, but with openness to alternatives. That is what happens when pressure stops working. People do not necessarily rebel loudly, they simply start looking elsewhere. Canada understood that dynamic and acted accordingly. By placing a diplomatic presence on the ground, it created a channel for everyday cooperation rather than episodic crisis management. That matters because most influence is built in routine decisions, not headline moments. We also need to talk about class and political economy here because geopolitics does not float above material interests. Greenland's economy is constrained by geography, by logistics, and by inherited structures of trade. High costs do not fall evenly. They fall on households, on workers, on small businesses trying to survive in a remote environment. When leaders talk about integration and new partnerships, they are responding to those pressures. They are trying to create room to maneuver within a system that has historically limited their choices. Canada's approach intersects directly with this reality. Clean energy investment, Arctic infrastructure, and long-term industrial planning are not abstract policy goals. They determine who pays for electricity, who gets stable work, and who absorbs risk when markets shift. When Canada aligns its diplomacy with these investments, it is effectively exporting stability. That makes it an attractive partner, especially compared to a model that exports volatility through tariffs and threats. The United States media rarely frames it this way because it would require asking uncomfortable questions about domestic priorities. Why has so much political energy gone into trade wars instead of rebuilding infrastructure? Why are public investments treated as ideological threats rather than tools of competitiveness? Why is cooperation so often portrayed as weakness, even when it delivers better outcomes for ordinary people? These questions challenge the underlying logic of how power has been exercised. Instead, we get stories about personalities, about whether Trump is serious or joking, about diplomatic spats and sharp quotes that keeps attention away from the structural shift underway. The Arctic is becoming a test case for a broader transition in global power, one where credibility comes from problem solving rather than posturing. Countries that invest in shared capacity gain influence without needing to demand it. For working people, this matters more than it might seem. When trade routes are reliable, prices are steadier. When energy systems are clean and publicly supported, costs are less exposed to geopolitical shocks. When diplomacy reduces friction instead of amplifying it, jobs are less likely to vanish overnight because of a tweet or a tariff. These are not abstract benefits. They shape daily life in ways that are only noticed when they disappear. So when you hear that Canada opened a consulate in Greenland, and the reaction was finally understand what that really means, it means someone felt seen. It means an alternative path became visible. It means that power for once flowed toward cooperation rather than coercion. And it means that the United States, by clinging to an outdated model of dominance, is learning a hard lesson about how influence actually works in a changing world. The deeper takeaway is not about any one leader or country. It is about systems that reward patience, investment, and respect tend to endure. Systems that reward speed, pressure, and spectacle tend to burn out. The Arctic is just one place where this contrast is becoming impossible to ignore. And if you start watching for it, you will see the same pattern playing out in trade, energy, and politics far beyond the ice. What makes this moment especially revealing is how quietly it unfolded. There was no emergency summit, no dramatic announcement meant to dominate the news cycle. Canada did not frame its move as a rebuke to the United States, even though it clearly altered the balance. That restraint is part of the strategy. When power is exercised through capacity, it does not need to announce itself loudly. It shows up in who gets the phone calls, who gets invited into planning conversations, and who becomes indispensable over time. Think about how this contrasts with the logic of tariff wars. Tariffs are blunt instruments. They raise prices, disrupt supply chains, and create uncertainty that ripples outward. Sometimes they deliver short-term leverage, but they almost always produce long-term resentment and adaptation. Firms look for workarounds. Countries diversify partners. Communities bear the cost while the promised revival rarely materializes. That is the cycle we have watched repeat itself. Canada's recent choices point in a different direction. Public investment in energy, especially nuclear and clean power, is not just about emissions. It is about insulating the economy from external shocks. When energy is stable and domestically anchored, manufacturers can plan, workers can rely on steadier employment, governments can negotiate from a position of confidence rather than desperation. This is why energy policy is foreign policy, whether leaders admit it or not. In the Arctic context, that matters enormously. Infrastructure is expensive, logistics are unforgiving. The partners who help solve those problems earn trust quickly. When Canada collaborates with Denmark and Greenland on clean technology and Arctic development, it is not just sharing expertise, it is embedding itself into the region's future. That is influence that cannot be reversed easily because it is built into systems rather than agreements alone. Meanwhile, the United States faces a contradiction it has not resolved. It wants strategic control without paying the full cost of maintenance. It wants loyalty without offering predictability. It wants markets to remain open to its firms while closing its own when politically convenient. Over time, that combination erodes credibility. Allies begin to hedge. Smaller partners begin to explore options that reduce exposure. That does not happen overnight, but it does happen steadily. For Greenland, the calculus is simple. More partners mean more leverage, means better terms, lower costs, and greater autonomy. The excitement around Canada's consulate is not about choosing sides. It is about expanding space to act. That distinction is crucial, and it is one that Washington often overlooks. When power is assumed rather than earned, it becomes brittle. This is also where class dynamics re-enter the picture. Decisions about trade routes, energy systems, and diplomatic alignment shape who bears risk. Under a confrontational model, risk is pushed downward. Workers absorb price spikes. Communities absorb closures. Under a capacity building model, risk is socialized and managed. Public investment smooths volatility. The benefits are shared more broadly, even if they are less visible in the moment. The media rarely connects these dots because doing so would require questioning deeply ingrained assumptions about markets and state action. It is easier to frame stories as clashes of will than as outcomes of policy design. But if you care about how economics actually shapes power, you have to look at the design. You have to ask who is building and who is merely demanding. Canada's move in Greenland is a reminder that geopolitics is not always about confrontation. Sometimes it is about confidence, about showing that you can deliver stability in an unstable world. Countries notice that, communities notice that, and once they do, influence shifts without fanfare. As this continues, watch how often similar patterns emerge elsewhere. Watch which countries invest in long-term capacity and which rely on short-term pressure. Watch where partnerships deepen quietly and where alliances fray noisily. These are not isolated events. They are signals of a broader transition in how power is exercised and experienced. And the Arctic warming faster than almost anywhere else is becoming one of the clearest places to see that transition unfold in real time. As this transition unfolds, it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how modern capitalism and state power interact. We are taught to believe that markets alone determine outcomes, that investment flows naturally to the most efficient place, that politics is a distraction layered on top of economics. But what this Arctic story shows is the opposite. Markets follow infrastructure. Capital follows stability, and stability is not a natural condition. It is built often deliberately through public choices. Canada's strategy makes this visible by committing public resources to energy, infrastructure, and regional cooperation. It lowers uncertainty for private actors. Firms know what kind of power they will have access to. Workers know industries are not built on temporary incentives that vanish with the next election. Partners know agreements are backed by physical systems, not just promises. This is how states quietly shape markets without constant intervention. It is not anti-market, it is market making. The United States, by contrast, has increasingly treated uncertainty as a bargaining chip. Tariffs are announced, revised, threatened again. Trade agreements are framed as conditional favors rather than shared commitments. For financial actors, this creates volatility that can be profitable in the short term but corrosive over time. For workers and communities, it creates insecurity without upside. That imbalance is not accidental. It reflects who has the power to absorb risk and who does not. In places like Greenland, where margins are thin and costs are high, that difference matters immediately. A delayed shipment, a price spike, a diplomatic misstep can ripple through everyday life. So when a partner shows up offering predictability rather than pressure, it is felt not just at the elite level but across society. This is why influence cannot be measured only in military assets or trade volumes. It has to be measured in lived experience. There is also a historical dimension we should not ignore. Arctic regions have long been treated as strategic spaces rather than live spaces. Decisions were made elsewhere, justified in the language of security or development with limited regard for local agency. That legacy still shapes trust today. Canada's emphasis on Inuit connections and respect for local autonomy resonates precisely because it counters that history. It signals a willingness to do things differently even within the constraints of existing systems. None of this guarantees a perfect outcome. Partnerships can fail, investments can be misdirected, power can still concentrate in ways that exclude. But the direction matters. A system that prioritizes capacity over coercion at least creates room for negotiation and correction. A system built on pressure leaves little space to adapt without conflict.